Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Next verse. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have had. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. This is the word of the Lord. So, now many of us have probably read this passage in isolation, meaning that when we read or think through this passage, we just imagine as if Jesus is telling the story and we are in the audience trying to interpret what does he mean by this story. And no matter how you do it, most of the traditional readings of this parable come out to be a moral lesson of being kind, being merciful to your neighbor, loving your neighbor, loving a complete stranger, right? That almost always comes out to be the conclusion and interpretation of this passage. And it's a good one. We should, in fact, love our neighbor. In fact, the term Good Samaritan, right, is a term when someone goes out of their way to help a stranger and become compassionate to them, right? Or maybe you take it a little deeper, a little more theological, right? Any hardcore theology nerds in the house, right? Maybe you interpret the passage as allegorical, right? The man on the road who got robbed is mankind, is a representation of Adam and Eve. And Jericho is Eden. And on the road from Jericho, on the road from Eden, all the way to Jerusalem, which is heaven or paradise, their travel is dangerous because the world is corrupt and full of sin. And the evildoers, the robbers that attack the man on the road is Satan. And then the priest and the Levi are the religious leaders that do nothing to help this person. And then we see the Good Samaritan is Jesus, the Messiah, comes and helps the person. And even when it says that he bandaged and poured oil to heal this person, it represents the Holy Spirit. And even when he tells the innkeeper, I will return back for this person, it reflects the second coming of Christ. Whoa. So maybe you interpret this even a bit deeper, a bit more theological. Now, I love that reading. I love the moral lesson of being kind and compassionate to your stranger. I love the theological interpretation that it foreshadows who Christ is and what he is doing. It is a message of the gospel. I love that interpretation. But it is the interpretation if you read it in isolation. But is that the point that Luke is trying to make? Is that the reason why Luke puts this story in this section of his gospel at a pivotal time in Jesus' ministry? I want us to think about that. Now we're going to put a pin in it and move on to the next story. So immediately after the story of the Good Samaritan, he continues on and tells this story, which closes the chapter in chapter 10. So we're going to read the story of Martha and Mary. So in verse 38, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he had said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparation that had been made. She came to him and said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, again, you read this story, and this story in isolation is about two sisters who have different priorities. And when you read this story, traditionally, it is interpreted and taught where doing the work of the Lord is not as important as the Lord of the work. Have you heard that? Has anyone heard that phrase? Right? It's a catchy phrase. I love it. I use it all the time. That the work of the Lord is not as important as the Lord of the work. Serving for Jesus is not as important as worshiping Jesus. Amen. Let's just pray. That's good enough, right? But again, we are missing something that Luke is trying to do by putting these stories back to back. They are interconnected. They are related. And there is a message and a point that Luke is trying to make. So which leads me to my next exegetical technique that we're going to learn. We learned about isolation versus in the writer and author's context. The second is the details, right? Does anyone know what an Easter egg is? An Easter egg? Okay, well, there's a bunch of Easter eggs in the Gospels, all right? And we can point up that slide, the Samaritan and Mary Easter eggs. Now, the detail of the Samaritan and the detail that it was Mary are Easter eggs to an ancient audience. Now, I didn't mention that Luke is a very technical writer. He's actually the most profound, prolific, technical and detailed New Testament writer in all of the Gospels and in the New Testament. Meaning that every time he puts a place, names a location, names a character, it is for a very specific reason. There is so much significance in the detail that he reveals. So we have to understand that when he says it was a Samaritan, and when he says that it was Mary sitting at the Lord's feet, it alters the interpretation completely. It's supposed to turn the story upside down. It's supposed to be a major plot twist when we hear it and alter what we think the passage means to know. Has anyone watched all of the Marvel movies, the MCU? Yeah? Okay, just me and Justin, okay? Just me and Justin. Now, I remember... So, when you watch a Marvel movie, there's always these Easter eggs all over, right? Because we watched all the movies and watched the shows and we read the comic books and we know everything that's going to happen and we get so excited. I remember when we watched the first movie, The Avengers. You guys watch The Avengers? There's someone that didn't watch The Avengers? Okay, that's good. You didn't watch The Avengers, Pastor Sam? Wow, okay. Well, you're gonna, spoiler alert. Okay, spoiler alert. I'm gonna spoil the movie. Now, The Avengers. I remember sitting in the theater when The Avengers happened. If you guys watch The Avengers, there's a post-credit scene in The Avengers that reveals the true villain of the entire Phase 2 MCU universe. Do you remember who that was? It wasn't that long ago, guys. Thanos. It showed Thanos' face at the end, the post-credit scene. And I remember, there it is. I remember, in the theater, I don't know about your theater, but our theater cheered. Whoa, oh my gosh, whoa, this is crazy, right? And I remember high-fiving the guy behind me. We were just going crazy. And then I'm looking at my wife, Eunice, and she's sitting who's that purple guy? Who's that? And I'm like, that's Thanos. How do you not know who Thanos is? And she's like, I don't know, right? And so she missed a huge Easter egg, right? So it's fine to interpret the Good Samaritan in the moral way, in even the theological, Christological way. And it's fine to interpret Martha and Mary being about the work of the Lord instead of the Lord of the work. That is fine, but I will tell you, the ancient audience and ancient readers, our church fathers, in their graves are saying, no, wait, no. It's Thanos. They are from their grave saying, no, you're missing something huge here. That's the gravity of the Samaritan detail and Mary detail. Okay? So let's test this out. So if I were to replace the Good Samaritan in the story, if I were to replace that with anyone, would that change the moral lesson of the story? If I were to just say, if Jesus were to say, and the third person was a Jewish man, and the Jewish man helped the man on the road, would that have changed the interpretation? Would it still mean we need to be loving to our neighbors, kind to strangers? Doesn't change the interpretation. What if he was a fisherman? What if he was a merchant? Would it change the interpretation? No. No. But why is it that when Jesus mentions that that man was a Samaritan, there is a huge plot twist? It raises alarms. It raises a huge Easter egg for the audience. This is crazy. In the same way, we look at Martha and Mary, right? Martha, she's in the back preparing the food and hosting and being hospitable. And then our sister Mary is in the room with Jesus, listening to the teacher. Now, what if it wasn't Mary? What if we replaced Mary with her brother Lazarus? What if it was Lazarus that wasn't helping Martha? Would there be any problem with the story? No. Because Martha is doing what she is expected to do, and Lazarus would be doing what he is expected to do. But why is it an issue that it is Mary? Why is it an issue with Mary? Why is she saying, Jesus, tell my sister to come and help me? Well, why not your brother, Martha? What about Lazarus? Why is it such a big deal that it is your sister? Well, obviously, it's because she's a woman. She's a woman. It is a big deal because Mary is a woman, and that is not what women are supposed to be doing. So we understand that because Jesus and Luke, or Luke, puts the detail that it is a Samaritan in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because Jesus is talking about Mary, and Luke is highlighting Mary being at the feet of Jesus, we understand that these two stories are connected. Now, what is Luke trying to say by putting these two stories back to back and together? Well, a major Luke theme in his theology in the Gospel of Luke is that the gospel overcomes major societal prejudice. Prejudice. See, it was shocking that it was a Samaritan. It's not shocking that a priest on the road would see a dead body. Well, he thinks he's dead. He doesn't know. And then turn to the side of the road and pass by. Because by law, a priest cannot touch a dead body. He would be marked unclean. Very, very normal. A Levite, who is the apprentice of a priest, would be right behind their master, their priest. And when he sees the priest do that, who is he to undermine his priest as his apprentice? So he needs to follow protocol and just follow what the priest had done. Now the story turns upside down because it was a Samaritan, which meant that Jews and Samaritans hate each other. There was so much hatred between these two groups that in fact, that the expert of the law that's listening to this story would expect that the Samaritan, as he saw the man, would come, spit, kick him even more, and make sure that he is dead, and maybe even rob him more. That is the expectation that the Jewish man would have when he hears the word Samaritan. But to think that the Samaritan would be so gracious, be so kind, go out of his way to show mercy, it challenged their racial paradigm and their racial prejudice against the Samaritan people. meaning that Jesus' gospel, his good news, overwhelmingly overcomes racial prejudice. Now, when you look at Martha and Mary, the reason why it is so radical that Mary was sitting at the Lord's feet is because in the Greek, when you read the term at the Lord's feet, we might not see it in English, but that's a Greek idiom that is only specified for disciples. In rabbinic literature, when one is sitting at one's feet, it means that they are designated in the place of a disciple. And it's not exclusive to rabbinic culture. It's also in Roman culture. It's also in Greek philosophical culture. That only a pupil, only an apprentice, only a disciple can sit at the master's feet and listen to them teaching. Women had zero rights in the ancient world. We think about the Samaritan woman who was divorced 5 times. Jesus had pity on her because he knew that women had no right to divorce. That an adulterous man could divorce her, another man could divorce her, another man could divorce her. She had no right to divorce, so she was rejected and thrown away 5 times in her life. That is the plight of women in the ancient world. They had no rights to be a disciple. They had no rights to choose who they marry. They had no rights to listen to a rabbinic teaching of any kind. They're only expected to be back there, to be in the kitchen, to be behind the scenes serving. That was the expectation of women in the ancient world. So to see a woman, to see Martha's sister sitting at the feet of the rabbi, it was revolutionary. It was revolutionary to see that Jesus' good news, Jesus' gospel and his ministry overcomes prejudice against women. It overcame the prejudice against women. Now, this is what we have to realize. How does Luke want to tell us and show us how the gospel moved in this period? One of the things that he shows us is that the gospel cannot be about us. We cannot be like the Samaritans or John and James who wanted to be politically motivated, who do their ministry out of political objective, political agendas. We cannot do the ministry of the gospel if we're just trying to ask Jesus in the church, how can I inherit eternal life? What can you do for me? What can Jesus do for me? How can Jesus make my life better? How can this church make my life better? How can I be a good person? How can I secure myself in heaven? The church in the gospel cannot move if we create people that are just, look at me. I'm doing so much. Look at me. How come I'm doing so much? They need to do more. The gospel cannot move in those conditions. The gospel moves when prejudice is radically overcome. Is radically overcome. And so how does the gospel move? The gospel moves when it's not about us, but when it overcomes prejudice. When it radically overcomes prejudice. That is when we see the gospel move. Now, I shared last week that I didn't grow up in Orange County. I shared that I grew up in San Diego. But I have made North Orange County my home. It is my home. Whether they have adopted me or I adopted them, it is my home now. Especially because my wife Eunice, North Orange County, Brea Fullerton is her home. She grew up here. And not only that, but God had called me to plant a church in North Orange County 5 years ago. And to be honest with you, if I can be honest, I was like, why? God, why? North Orange County, there's a lot of churches here. In fact, the data shows that there are like 1,000. There's 1,000 churches in Orange County. Why do they need another church? Well, as I've done ministry here for the past 10 years, I have got to see slowly why it is. There might be a lot of churches, but there is much work to be done in overcoming the historical prejudice in these cities. Now, Orange County, quick trivia fact. Do you know why it is called Orange County? The oranges, that's right. The orange groves, right? The citrus industry was very bountiful and plentiful here in Orange County. The Valencia orange, that is from here. And in fact, during the 1890s to the 1960s, it is the citrus industry that was the second biggest economy in California. The first being oil, the second, oranges. Oranges. It was bigger than gold, to give you another reference. The orange industry. And in fact, right down the street, the Bassenturi family owned the largest orange grove ranch here in North Orange County called Sunny Hills Ranch. Did you know that? Sunny Hills Ranch. Now, here's the issue. Even from that time, during the citrus industry, North Orange County has experienced major historical prejudice. And in fact, the first people group that they were prejudiced against was Asian immigrants. The orange grove industry attracted many migrant and immigrant workers. But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and then Japanese internment after that, North Orange County saw their population of Asians in this land extinguished. And in order to fill that vacuum of workers, it gave rise to Mexican migrants to be the primary labor force, to be the pickers and packagers in the citrus orange industry. Now, this is where the story gets really, really sad. The ranch owners saw all the Mexican migrant, the Latino community, coming in waves and settling here in North Orange County. So in fact, the ranch owners band together and decided to put strict segregation policies, enforcing all of the Mexican migrant workers to live in one tiny little area where they would build tiny camps. In fact, it almost looked like concentration camps where they put them. And it was an area, right below Commonwealth, maybe right up until where the 91 freeway is today. And they got so worried because they saw all of the Hispanic migrants starting to populate and having lots and lots of children. And so the Anglo ranch owners feared that their children will start going to their children's schools. So they started to build schools for Mexican only, migrant workers only, in the camps right below Commonwealth. Now here's the sad part. Over 100 years have gone by. If you look at the exact location of the map, south of Commonwealth up into the 91, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. It is still considered the barrio of North Orange County. It is still considered to have some of the most under-resourced and struggling schools in the area, predominantly Hispanic. And you might say wait, but Eddie, North Orange County is known for the great public schools. Fullerton, Brea, Yorba Linda, Placentia. Yeah, half of the schools are great. The other half, not so great. Nothing has changed. Fast forward to the 1960s, the Federal Housing Administration created something called the FHA loan. Anyone ever use an FHA loan to purchase a home, right? The FHA loan allowed lower to middle class Americans to purchase a home through a subsidized loan with a very low interest rate. But the problem was the FHA loan in the 1960s here in North Orange County were only available to whites only. Whites only. Meaning that they would not lend to blacks, Latinos, and even Asians during that time. And if you bought a home in North Orange County, you know that the property value in the past 50 years has astronomically went up. And we think about the generational wealth that our parents and our grandparents were excluded from during that history. In fact, the other major landowner, Richard Nixon's father, owned the other huge plot of land just east of here. And also, they had racial covenants excluding and prohibiting blacks, Latinos, and Asians from renting and owning property in that land. That land today is now called the city of Yorba Linda. George and Edward Amherst bought 100 acres of land in North Orange County, literally drawing a rectangle, red lining, meaning that no blacks could apply for a loan to purchase a home and even rent in this square box. Now, our country is over 12% black and African American. California, over 7% black and African American. Orange County, less than 2% African American. And that is by no accident. It is founded upon historical prejudice. Prejudice. You see, there's a lot of churches, yes. But there's still way much more that the gospel can move to overcome this prejudice. You know, we're seeing the gospel move, though. We're seeing the gospel move. Let me give you an example. This building, this sanctuary that we are in right now, you know, it was very difficult before we decided to partner and merge with Hillside, LA. You know, I went to many facilities and churches to try to rent during the pandemic. And they're all businessmen, I get it. They're all trying to lock you into 10-year leases, you know, price gouging your rents, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. And then, but the churches, I've noticed, and I'm going to be very honest with you. I've noticed that the churches, they were uncomfortable allowing an Asian church to come into their facility because through conversation, they did not want the community to think that now this is an Asian church, that this is an Asian center, and that only Asians can come here now. They were very nervous about that. And so there was a bit of prejudice in trying to rent some churches. But thanks be to God, David Bay, one of our founding members here at Hillside North OC, approached this church, Refinery Church. And I'll tell you, before we approached them, Pastor Kelly, the pastor here at Refinery, one of the pastors here, he shared with me how as that he was praying for the gospel to move at this church and his community, in his congregation. He was praying, and guess who he was praying for? He was saying, we are failing at ministering and moving the gospel to the Asian community in Brea in North Orange County. He was praying that. He was repenting of that. And he said that I was praying that God would the gospel move. And then when we show up, we partnered. And he has allowed us to worship here in their beautiful, beautiful facility. And because of that, the gospel can move further. The gospel can move further because of our partnership together. I'm going to close with one last thing. I know we're almost out of time. But we've seen the gospel move in other ways in overcoming prejudice with women. You know, when I planted the church before our merged church, it was called Hug. It was called Hug Church. And our very first executive pastor was a woman named Angela Yi, a Chinese-American woman. And the reason why I asked her to become our very first executive pastor is because she has come from many influential churches. But what I've noticed as her friend, that she was always underutilized, underappreciated, and undervalued for the amount of talent and strategy and leadership potential that she had possessed. And so I asked her to be our executive pastor, and I will tell you, there were times, week after week, we'd be sitting in my office, and she would be crying. She would be crying because she said, I've never felt so validated and so seen and so affirmed for what God has gifted me with. Gifted me with. She would share about how she would come to her church, and the first thing that they would ask her to do is do children's ministry. How about you to be an administrative assistant? How about you do some women's ministry coordination? And she's like, I'm not good at any of those things. But she is a great leader and strategist and operations person. And it was fantastic. I miss her so much. But the reason why she had to resign from our church is because we were a part of a denomination called the ECC, the Evangelical Covenant Church. And the president felt called by God to appoint his next vice president of the denomination a woman. And so he asked for a list of all the executive pastors in the denomination in the entire country. And it was a list less than 10 in the entire country. A list less than 10 in the entire country of female women executive pastors in our denomination. There are thousands of congregations in the country. But Angela was one of the 8, and she interviewed and she killed it because she is the best candidate. And right now, Angela Yee, our former executive pastor, is the second most powerful and influential person in the entire national denomination. But not only that, that's not what's a big deal. It's that she inspired hundreds of women in the denomination to see what is capable and what is possible for them. That they can be more and aspire more in the church than being an administrative assistant. They can be more and aspire more than being a children's director or a women's ministry director. Church, imagine what it would look like if we were a church not about us, not caring about us, not caring about building our Tower of Babel, trying to become bigger, better, faster, but we cared about the prejudice outside happening there, wanting to do miracles outside over there. Imagine what it would look like if we were a church where the sisters in our church, where we're not a church that are run by men, all right? Where the leadership is all men and the pastors are all men and we just ignore 50% of the population in our communities. But we appoint and affirm and elevate our sisters to know that they are gifted. You are gifted. You are a leader. You are worthy. Imagine what it would look like if we were a church where we radically overcome any prejudice of any kind, where you can feel confident and safe to bring your friend to this ministry and know that they will be blessed. Know that they will suffer no prejudice here, no racism here, no judgment here, no discrimination here, no bigotry here. Imagine what it would look like if we can bring anyone here and be blessed and experience a miracle. Church, the gospel moves when it's not about us. It moves when we overcome prejudice. Now I want to invite Pastor Sam to come up, or Justin to come up. And again, one of the things that we want to do here is we not only want to hear and passively listen to God's word, but we want to experience and reflect and respond. And so our brother Justin is going to lead us into a time of reflection and response.
If I have the worship team come up, if that's okay. Hey, can we give it up for Pastor Eddie? I mean, that was pretty amazing.